Tonight, Voices is a little different, because there are only two of us, Susan Santag and myself, John Berger. Susan and I have quite a lot of things in common, I think. We both write essays about literature, about ideas. We both have worked for films. Susan has just come back from Rome, where she's been making a film based on one of her own short stories. I've written film scenarios. We've both, from time to time, written quite a lot about photography, about the visual photographic image. And then finally, and perhaps most important of all for tonight, we both write fiction, novels and short stories. And tonight we are going to exchange views and experiences about this activity, somewhat mysterious really, this activity of telling stories. If I think of somebody telling a story, I see a group of people huddled together, and around them a vast space, quite frightening. Maybe they are huddled against a wall, maybe they're around a fire. And somewhere for me, in the very idea of the story, there is something to do with shelter. The shelter, perhaps, of the voyager, the traveler who has come home, who has lived to tell the story. Or the soldier who has come back, who has survived. So there is this almost physical sense of shelter, where the story represents a kind of habitation, a kind of home. But then, inside the story, there's another kind of shelter. Because what the story narrates and tells is sheltered within the story from oblivion, forgetfulness, and daily indifference.
But you're talking about stories in a very remote kind of society that's quite different from ours, because surely storytelling is much more diversified in the societies that we know. Parents tell stories to children. Children ask for stories. We experience stories mediated through images, as in television and movies. We read stories in print. I think that the most archaic definition of storytelling, it does tell us something about, we imagine where storytelling comes from, but it doesn't tell us very much about what stories have become, I think, or what the challenge of storytelling is now.
Yes, I agree. But I'm not certain that something of that primitive origin doesn't remain. For instance, when children hear stories, or when we were children, and they told us stories, when does it happen? In bed, in this strange no man's land between waking and sleep. And in that telling of a story, or listening to a story, there is something reassuring. And very curious, because the more exciting, the more threatening the story, the more reassuring it is. Why?
But John, don't you think that people make a distinction between a story that is true and a story that is imagined or invented? I'm always struck by the fact that there's a kind of ambiguity in the very notion of storytelling. On the one hand, we think of storytelling as a truth-telling activity. Tell me the real story. We think of stories as bringing information. We think of stories as revealing secrets. Stories, true stories that might be told after someone's death, because, for instance, the death of someone is generally an occasion for telling stories about a person's life, and maybe some truth comes out that wasn't discussed or generally shared before that person was gone. But we also think of stories as, that's only a story, or don't tell me stories, meaning don't tell me lies. And don't you think at the very center of the whole enterprise of storytelling there is the fact that storytelling is an activity that faces in two directions? On the one hand, it's connected with an idea of truth. On the other hand, it's connected with an idea of invention, imagination, lies. One is thrilled by the story precisely because it describes something that can't happen. It's connected with fantasy. I think it's also so complicated, and the model of the voyager or the returning soldier who is telling what really happened, who is bringing exotic news and telling terrible stories generally, is only one model of storytelling.
Yes, yes. I don't want to insist too much upon that. And probably those stories were very embroidered. Yes, the story exists somewhere between fiction and truth. I agree. If I think now, straight away, of my own personal experience in telling stories or writing stories, I think they begin off, for me, and they have to begin off, as truth. For instance, I won't tell you the whole story, but
yes,
a little one. A man I knew in the village where I live, a shepherd, with about 100 sheep. And he fell in love. Fell in love with a woman, married, not from the village, from the town. A long love affair, well, for a couple of years, very passionate, probably with the complicity of the husband. And the woman, well, he gave her many things. Half of what he had, at least, including a house. And then she turned him out. And he decided to die. He didn't kill himself. He went on a kind of hunger strike. And then he died. When I think of him now, I can see his face, his very large hands, his eyes. That was truth. Then I tried to write that story.
And then you started inventing.
I started inventing, but in relation to the truth. But, if it worked, I don't know, this story will be read as fiction. And it will be read as fiction about a story of more or less unrequited love. And why will it be fiction? Because it will exist both everywhere and nowhere. And it is that displacement of place and time which makes something fiction, it seems to me.
But why would it be read as taking place everywhere and nowhere? Don't you situate it in the village where you live?
For me, it's situated in the village. But as soon as one reads a story, when we read other people's stories, we have an idea of that place, but it becomes part of our experience and therefore is displaced from where it really took place. I mean, it seems to me that fiction is something which exists, which goes beyond its immediate time or its immediate place. And it's exactly that which makes it fiction, or what we call fiction.
I don't have that experience, I think. Well, of course it's true that I'm not where the story is taking place, but if you're talking about some kind of traditional storytelling which is grounded in a particular place, if I read a story of Tolstoy,
yes,
I think I'm in 19th century or early 20th century Russia. I don't think it's taking place everywhere.
But it applies to you and your experience of life.
Not necessarily. No, it might instruct my experience rather than apply to it. I mean, I'm not looking to see myself projected in stories any more than I'm trying to express myself when I write stories. No, I don't think stories are necessarily universal because they're read by very different kinds of people. Some stories, because the most powerful form of storytelling is very compact, and if it's very compact, it's likely to be very economical in its details, and therefore this economy can be experienced by us with our modern ways of looking at things as something abstract. And in that sense, it may take on a certain universality. But I think it is the particularity of storytelling and the fact that we now have available to us stories from every part of the world that fascinates us. And I don't ask that the story address my experience. I ask that my experience, so to speak, make it possible for me to understand the story.
Yes.
I'm not looking for myself in the story. I think I have maybe another way of looking at it from you, because I really start not from the oral tradition, but from the literary tradition. If I think of storytelling, let's say the parent to the child now usually in our society is reading a story rather than telling a story. We have so many stories available to us. In fact, sometimes people say that we have a surfeit of stories, which is why storytelling is often thought to be in a state of crisis. And so my model is originally a literary model, and I'm a city dweller. And you're someone who has lived a large part of your life, though you grew up, as I understand, in London, in a peasant community in the south of France. And therefore you feel closer by choice, because you've chosen to live there, to another, what many people would think of as an older form of storytelling, which is oral. And you have the stories of these people's lives whom you come to know, and you want to tell their stories to other people, because there's, I think, an ethical assumption behind your work that there are stories which have not been told, certain kinds of people and certain kinds of experience which have not found voice, and you want to give voice to or experiences which are neglected, or regenerate or revive certain forms of storytelling which are neglected now in favor of perhaps more sophisticated, city-oriented, print-oriented kind of storytelling. I mean, isn't that what you're saying? When you told this fascinating story about the shepherd and his unrequited love and his kind of suicide, the reason you wanted to tell the story is that you were moved by him, and he was a kind of person that perhaps you don't find in our literature as much anymore, although obviously there are. I mean, one only has to go back to Hardy, if not to other examples, to find stories of that kind, but perhaps they're not told today as often. And so don't you feel that some stories should be told rather than other stories? Isn't that behind your attitude towards storytelling?
I think it's less, perhaps it's less sociological than that. It doesn't really concern me whether that kind of story exists in literature or not. If I'm very, very honest, I mean, it is because that life was lived, I see a kind of meaning in it, and I would like to retain it, so that it is not lost, not forgotten. I mean, whether we're telling stories in a city context or in a village, probably you'll agree that, in fact, stories begin at their end. I mean, in life. I mean, the story of Romeo and Juliet, in a sense, begins at their death. That is when the story is given form. The end is not always death, but it quite frequently is.
That's a point I think that's worth talking about, why death seems the natural end of a story, and in the most traditional form of storytelling I think that it is. Is it because a death is the natural end of a life, and what stories are about are lives? You see, I think they're about much more than that, and but that is certainly one model of storytelling, to tell the story of a life, to give the value of a life in the form of a story which has its natural end as a death. But if I think, for instance, of the first stories that I remember reading which really marked me as a person, and undoubtedly as a writer too, were the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. And those are not stories of a life, but they are real stories, absolutely unforgettable stories. They are stories generally of a disaster. which may or may not end in death. It often does, but they are terrifying stories. They are fabulous stories, and on the whole, they are invented stories. And the storyteller is the person who invents. We have examples of that now in writers like Calvino and Borges, who certainly think of themselves as storytellers, but they're not telling stories of lives. They're telling stories of dilemmas, let's say, which often are catastrophes. What about that kind of storytelling, as opposed to rendering a life? It's quite another model, and it's one that interests me very much.
I think that the fantastic story, what does it tell us? I mean, you tell me. What is our need for the fantastic story? We have it. I agree with you. I agree with you. But why?
Well, I think people want to travel outside themselves. I think there's a need for vicarious experience that is not necessarily identical with the need for truth. I think there's a need for fantasy. I think there is a longing to see taboos broken, violated. There is well, the imagination runs riot. And I think that kind of storytelling is very important. I must say it does appeal more to me. I always feel when I'm writing stories that, well, I'm inventing, and I might use something from my own life or the life of someone I know, but I feel as if I'm lending that to something that is basically invented and that therefore basically fantastic. And I think of fiction, but again, I'm just speaking for myself and thinking of examples of fiction that I like very much. I think of fiction as a kind of speculativeness, a kind of fantasy. I'm interested in moral fantasies, moral science fiction even. And this could have the form of some kind of history or actually be placed in the past as well as in the future or in the present.
If we take the experience of writing a story or of listening to one, the story, it seems to me every story has its own subjectivity. Now I emphasize that because I think this subjectivity is an area where what you call the truthful and the fantastic actually coexist, because it is a subjectivity.
Do you mean a voice?
Well, a voice in a minute, Susan. We must talk about that. But no, I mean a kind of subjectivity. Now, and it seems to me this subjectivity is a kind of amalgam of three elements or three people. The storyteller or the writer, the protagonists of the story and their subjectivity, and then lastly, the subjectivity of the listener. And the story, there is already a kind of cooperation between these three, which actually makes the subjectivity of that story.
It's very strange to me what you're saying, because I can't feel the subjectivity of the listener or the reader. To me that is, of course I think if I write a story it will be read. I wouldn't write if I didn't think that I could be read. But I can't imagine how that could actually be part of the story.
When you were a child, remember listening to stories? And who were you? You were yourself, you were the person telling you the story, and you were the characters, all mixed together in a rather reassuring way.
Maybe that's because I think the difference between hearing stories and reading them is greater than you do. We have to stop now, and we'll be back in a moment.
Susan, you were making a distinction between the printed story and literature and the spoken story, the oral tradition. And you're saying that I'm more embedded in the second than the first. Now, I think that is only apparently so. Because...
Only apparently so that you're embedded in the second?
Yes, only apparently so. Because they're not all. I want them to be read as though they were spoken, but they are not, and they have never been spoken. And all the devices I use are in fact literary devices. I mean, that's to say, they're devices that I have learned from my experience of literature and of reading masters. So it is a form, but it is in fact a literary form.
No, but I'm not denying that you're making literature when you tell, say, the story about the peasant, the shepherd who commits suicide when he's thrown out by the woman he loves. I'm saying that you are trying to equate telling a story with writing a story. In other words, you're saying writing is a kind of telling. Writing is the telling with art, so to speak. It's a transformation of oral telling. What I'm saying, and that I think is one of the points on which we disagree, is I think that once people began to write stories, they told different kinds of stories, that there was a radical break with the oral tradition, that there are things that you can tell in a written form, there are things you want to tell in a written form, which you couldn't tell in an oral form. For instance, I know in my own story writing, I'm very interested in telling several stories at the same time, and sometimes cutting back from one to another. I suppose it's something that I learned not only from literature, but more obviously from movies, from cutting in movies, cutting back from one shot to another, or keeping several stories going at the same time. The famous model is Griffith's Intolerance. Now, that's the kind of thing that you can't do orally. So I really think there is a radical break. It's not just the addition of art or artfulness, but a tremendous expansion and modification of storytelling that comes when you have the resources of print and when you are reading with the eyes as opposed to hearing with the ears.
Yes. All right. You're trying to tell several stories at the same time, and it's a bit like editing a film. It's a bit like montage. But that exists, I think, in any form of story. Because, and let's be technical almost, because of what is not said. So important. What happens between the sentences, even sometimes between the words. You have a sentence, and he went out of the house and left the door open. That's one sentence. As soon as a second sentence is put onto that, which is the mad dog was in the orchard.
You have a cut.
You have a cut, because the door is open and the mad dog is in the orchard. This happens whether a story is told orally, whether it is written, if it is well told. There is always these jumps. And through the duration of the story, a kind of complicity is built up. Because each one of those jumps is based upon certain assumptions, which the writer makes about the reader's reactions. And bit by bit, these assumptions are more and more taken for granted, and you begin to have this complicity between storyteller or writer and reader or listener.
But isn't it just that you can't say everything? I mean, if you would tell the story of a day, not even a day, an hour in anyone's life, you could write 1,000 pages. So and in storytelling, as in every other form of art, there's a process of selection. But if the person goes out the door and leaves the house and leaves the door, exits from the house and leaves the door open, and then you cut to the mad dog in the orchard, it's only 2 stories if you're going to follow the man somewhere else and then also tell a long story about the dog. The assumption is that the man and the dog will meet, that the dog in the orchard has something to do with the man, but you don't describe step by step as he goes down the walk and goes toward the orchard or avoids the orchard or whatever it is. I mean, I don't think that constitutes telling many stories. The fact that from one sentence to the next you're featuring a different detail, and in fact you're skipping time, you're skipping all sorts of things that you could be telling. The question is, of course, what kind of detail are we interested in telling? And there we have a very particular set of traditions that we're responsive to as writers. For instance, since Flaubert, we have been very interested as writers and as readers and very moved by a sort of off-center detail, an unexpected detail. Flaubert in Madame Bovary describing Charles looking at the back of Emma's neck, for instance, or the way the angle of her elbow as she poured a pitcher of milk. We look for the angular or the eccentric detail as illustrating what? As illustrating the story, or as having, in fact, I think, some kind of autonomy, some sort of independent sensual effect, which is what we're looking for in storytelling. That's a particular literary tradition. I mean, if you read Defoe, if you read Moll Flanders, for instance, you're not going to get that kind of detail that you get many literary generations later in someone like Flaubert.
In the choosing, in the selecting, one chooses what one judges to be essential. Because when I go back to my beginning, it seems to me that all fiction is a fight against the absurd.
Is that your beginning?
Well, it was behind my beginning.
Yes.
It was the end in my beginning. Because in a dream, for example, dreams can be terrifying, nightmares. But in a dream, there is nothing which does not have a signification. And I'm not talking now about psychoanalytical explanations afterwards. I mean, in the dreaming state, everything that one sees, everything that happens, has a meaning. There is nothing which is meaningless. Mm-hmm. Because that is the way our minds are structured. And it seems to me it is the same in fiction. If it works, if it is really viable. Everything that is included has a meaning. Not necessarily an explicit one, but an implicit one.
Yes, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think that what happens in dreaming, as in anything else, is that once you have the narration, or once you have the event, then you can always assign meaning to it, and you want to assign meaning to it. But I don't think the meaning resides in the details. I don't think that every event in a dream has meaning. I think you can impute meaning to it. You can assign meaning to it.
No, you experience it as meaning in the dream. I'm not talking about the interpretation of the dream afterwards.
Oh, I don't think you experience anything. Well, here we have a real disagreement, because I think that the dream, and I'm surprised I'm taking this position, I would think you would take it. I think, in fact, that the dream is the telling of the dream. I don't think the dream exists, or as soon as it exists, it doesn't exist. But what does exist is the already highly selective account that you make of the dream to yourself, writing it out, or to someone else, saying, I had this incredible dream last night. And then as you begin to talk about it, you say, well, actually, that old woman reminded me of my aunt, and actually the chair in that room was a chair in the dormitory in the school that I went to when I was 9 years old. And you begin to find associations. And I think that makes the kind of meaning that we, that's a very simple level of meaning, that we assign to dreams. And even in stories, I don't know that I would say that every detail has to be essential. I would say that every detail has to be powerful. Every detail has to be thrilling. And then after the fact, because a story should have some quality of inevitability or necessity. And perhaps it's that we then say gives it some essential quality.
No, I think we differ, because for me, a story is always a rescuing operation, which is another way of saying a shelter.
Well, of the absurd?
Against the absurd, against that endless, terrifying space in which we live. Let's go back for a moment.
I don't understand that. Why does it rescue us from the absurd? Why?
Because it is preserved, because that experience which the story relates, and it doesn't matter whether it is invented or based on fact. I mean, that is always a false question, and it is always an extraordinary mixture of one of the other with the other. You know, I mean, what do you invent? What is real? It's not interesting, I'm sure. But it is something, in actual fact, which somewhere, somehow, has been lived. In being related, and the word is interesting, related, or if you like, narrated, but let's say related. In being related, it is given meaning. It is given meaning partly because everything in it is related, one thing to another. It becomes coherent. It is given form. And the meaning, of course, because otherwise the story merely becomes extremely didactic. It isn't that it imposes a meaning upon the story. But the story contains a meaning. When I wrote a story you know, called the 3 Lives of Lucy Cabral, which is a story about a peasant woman, and the first life is about her childhood, and the second life is about her middle age, and the third life is about what happens to her after death. And in the village where I live, quite a lot of friends, peasants, read this. And not only once, but twice or 3 times, they made the same remark to me. They said, well, you know, in fact, Lucy Cabral has 4 lives. I say, what? Yes, because she has her 4th life in your story.
Well, now
it wasn't a literary compliment, that. That's the important thing.
Now I know why you think of audience in a way that I don't. If you were actually reading your stories to people who know the characters on whom they're based, of course, you have an experience which is extremely rare for a contemporary writer. When I write a story, I'm sure that, well, I don't have a privileged first audience in the sense that I'm not part of a small community in the way that you are. And I'm not telling a story that people will immediately recognize as part of their experience. I mean, in a way, you're more like, oh, let's say a Soviet writer who will telling stories about the Gulag and know that a part of his audience will be people who have been in those camps and will be judging his story by the criteria of their own experience. It was really like that, and at last this person is really telling the world how it was for us. I think it's very admirable and very moving, but it is still only one kind of storytelling. There is another kind of storytelling which I think is freer of that kind of ethical responsibility which you're assuming as part of the storyteller's vocation, and which gives that essential quality to storytelling. I think, for instance, one could reverse what you're saying and say not that the story redeems reality, as if reality has no meaning, but the storyteller gives it meaning. But you could say simply that, or not simply, that the storyteller enlarges the field of our imagination and introduces us to the absurd, because on the contrary, it's not that we live in terror of the absurd, but rather we live... No, I don't think most people do. I think rather we live with our imagination very quiet, very still, at least after a certain age, and with all kinds of terrible conformities which make life much more...
But why terrible? Because they suggest the absurd.
No, because they deprive us or cut us off from the life of the mind and the life of the imagination. And that perhaps one of the functions of storytelling, I would say, is to introduce a sense of the fantastic, which might include the absurd, rather than to redeem reality from its absurd or meaningless aspect. I don't think that stories necessarily have meaning. In fact, I don't even know what that means. I don't know. I'll tell you the last 3 works of fiction which I read, which it's completely arbitrary. And none of these books are modern. The last 3 books of fiction I read were Villette by Charlotte Bronte, Berger's Daughter Berger's Daughter, rather. I'm mixing it up with your name, John. Berger's Daughter by Nadine Gordimer, and Flush by Virginia Woolf. Now, all three of these books of fiction tell stories. Flush tells the story of the Brownings, viewed through the eyes of the Cocker Spaniel that belonged to Elizabeth Barrett. She eloped with it, and she went with Robert Browning. And Villette, which is the unknown, wonderful novel by the author of Jane Eyre, tells a story of a school teacher in Brussels, based obviously on Charlotte Bronte's own experience when she was a very young woman. And the Nadine Gordimer novel tells the story of a woman, a young woman in South Africa. I must say, all of these are stories, and yet it was character and hallucinatory detail in these stories. I mean, the Cocker Spaniel in Florence smelling urine on the sidewalk and noticing the difference between Italian vegetables and London vegetables, or in the Charlotte Bronte novel, it's extremely hallucinatory. One could almost say surrealistic in the account of this boarding school in Brussels. And the same for the best passages in Nadine Gordimer's book, and she's a wonderfully sensual writer. I don't think it was the story that interested me. It was being carried away by a character and feeling my imagination and my sense of language raised to a new pitch by the art of language and the way in which almost anything could be related by these three very different writers. That, in fact, all three of them told the story of a life was almost secondary, and I don't know what the meaning is except to establish the rights of intensity. I think of that as the quality of fiction and storytelling, restoring the claims of intensity of feeling. I love a story that makes me cry, for instance, and I don't mean that it has to do with some meaning that I could sum up.
It seems to me, I mean, yes, I think here we really differ. There is no intensity in a story which actually matches the intensity of what is lived. And I think we have two different views, because you, in a way, you say you want to be carried away by the story. I'm saying I want the story to stop things being carried away into oblivion and into indifference. And you're right. I mean, the fact that I live in a village is very important for lots of reasons. We were talking earlier about death. Death as often being the end of the story, which is actually where the story begins. That's to say, it's where one begins writing it or telling it. Somebody dies. Now, it is not just a question of tact that one then says, well, perhaps it is possible to tell that story. It's not only that. That's a relatively superficial thing. It's because after that death,
the life is finished.
One can read that life. The life becomes readable.
Well, a person who dies at 37 is not the same as a person who dies at 77.
No, but it can be somebody who dies at 90. The life becomes readable to the storyteller or to the writer, and then she or he can begin to write that.
Well, that would make marriage, which is also another traditional, not contemporary ending for stories, equivalent to death. That is, if one sees life as only having a meaning in your sense because it leads up to something, then that could be that it leads up to its end, or it leads up to at least its transformation, let's say, in the traditional way that marriage was viewed as a transformation.
Yes. I mean, for example, I don't think it exists here in England, but yes, I mean, the origin of the stag party before the marriage. That is in actual fact the end of a certain part of life.
Well, I was thinking of Shakespeare, actually. If you could say that generally the comedies end in marriages and the tragedies end in deaths. Both of them are endings in the sense that the life is seen as leading up to this. And whatever comes after is another life, another kind of life.
But let me go back. It seems to me that a life becomes readable and therefore recountable when it has come to an end, which puts the writer or the storyteller into a strange category. I mean, he's a kind of secretary of death. He's death's secretary. Very familiar. But what he reads, of course, is not death, but is life. He reads, as it were, across that blackness. And he begins to write. And there is a counter-movement in time, because life goes on in one direction. The story turns in the other. I mean, in those early Latin inscriptions, the very early ones, there's a term for it. What's it called? Bustrophaedron, or something like that. Anyway, it's as the ox turns in ploughing. Because you had one line which went like that, and then they didn't begin the other line there, but it went like that. So you have that movement.
But do you really think that a life is only intelligible when it's over? I don't
Intelligible?
think so.
No,
only read
its
it.
total, its full meaning is only apparent. It's intelligible, it's understandable before, of course. Of course.
But then you are saying that the central thing about storytelling is to tell a life, and if the maximal understanding of a life only comes after death, then the basic model of storytelling for you, of narration for you, is telling the story of a life. And that's, you see, where I don't agree. I mean, I think that's a very interesting model, and I suppose it is an archaic model, not the only one, because there are other stories that are told which don't involve simply a single life, but involve, let's say, an event like a campaign in a war or something of that sort, which often is punctuated by death. And I love your formulation that the writer is death's secretary. I think that that's true, but I think it's true in a less literal way than you are suggesting, because I guess I still balk at the idea that the fundamental thing about storytelling is telling the story of a life, or I presume you would expand that to mean a series of lives, of a family. It could be a family or a community or whatever. Don't you think there are many other kinds of storytelling? And don't you think that there are...
No, I do.
Are lots of wonderful narrations whose central strength is the depiction of character, in which incident is relatively unimportant or only illustrative. I mean, there's an awful lot of modern storytelling in which action is relatively immobilized, and what story there is almost presumed to be known, and therefore the main part of the storytelling is really a comment on a story, a comment on something that one already knows to be happening. It's not in the and then form. And I think this is a great achievement. I think we've enormously expanded the resources of storytelling. I don't feel as many people do that fiction is dead, or that we have exhausted the possibilities of storytelling, or as we get further from older models, oral models, we are impoverishing ourselves. I think we're expanding the possibilities.
Yes. Let me go back to something you said there. And I'm not arguing. I mean, I'm arguing from the point of view of, my own point of view, as how
I'm arguing from my point of view, too.
No, but I'm... Yes. It's not... what I'm saying is not exhaustive. I mean, I think there are many other forms of storytelling. I have the feeling that mine is somewhere at the heart of the matter, but there are other forms. The comment. I think that as soon as a story is printed, this is very important, as soon as a story is printed, it is transportable in a way that an oral story isn't. Therefore, it may be about one place, it may be written in one place, but it can go to many places. Mm-hmm. And however faithful that story is, to an imagined or a real life or series of lives or incidents, there is a kind of comment which needs to come in, and which is why the storyteller is necessary. Because if that story was told in reality by any of the protagonists, they would be seeing it completely from the center. The storyteller is both at the center, intimate, and at a distance, on the horizon. He is, in a sort of way, the horizon, with one side of him, to the story, and the other side, which is going way, way beyond that place, that land, that time, to the general. Maybe the only little contribution that the storyteller makes is to place stories in that context where, and that is terribly true now in this 20th century, where everybody lives in the whole world, across the whole planet.
Hearing stories from everywhere.
Yes. So that what happens is that that story, which may be some tiny little affair in some tiny village or some back street of a city, is somehow placed in the modern world. How? Not by crude statements of comparison or historical argument or political argument. It's a very, very, very subtle process. How somehow you have to give the feeling that what is being narrated there coexists in the world where China exists and the Pacific Ocean, and there are men who have been to the moon.
But I see a bigger and bigger difference between us, because you see the world as full of stories, and then you see these special people who constitute themselves as storytellers, and who now generally don't use the word. They say they're writers. And they tell these stories. They are the bearer of stories. They are the transmitters or emitters of stories.
Vehicles.
The vehicles, the secretaries, if you will, the secretary of stories, the secretaries of death. I don't see that the world is full of stories in that sense. I mean, I think the story starts with the writer. I don't think that there is a story and then the writer claims it and transforms it and puts his or her voice into it and adds this subjectivity. I think the writer is, to begin with, the originator of stories, and there are no stories outside of literature.
We must stop there for a moment and we'll go on. Susan, we both write essays and we both write fiction. For me, in fact, the two activities are not very different.
How?
Well, first of all, I'm not very verbal. Really, I have no facility with words.
I don't believe that.
No, it's true. It's true. And the struggle for me to write anything, essay or fiction, is always that there is a kind of model of something that I've seen or something that I've perceived in some way or another. It may be in a life, it may be in a film, or it may be in a painting or a work of literature, somebody else's. Something which I feel which is almost by definition unsayable, which exists there, or a bit like a melody of music, a bit like a pattern of colors, sometimes a bit like a geometric form. And the struggle is always to try to recreate that in words. The struggle is a question of precision, so that finally the words are as close as possible. They're never close enough, but as close as possible to that model, which is non-verbal, which I have felt, intuited, perceived, sensed. And it's not very different whether I'm writing about a work of art or whether I'm writing about a banquet or a wedding party or a death.
Well, it's not the same for me. When I write essays and when I write stories, it seems to me an entirely different activity. In fact, I really have the impression that I have to sort of take my head off and put another head on in order to do this. I mean, what they have in common is the struggle, of course. Writing is a very painful activity, and it's very difficult.
There are more painful ones.
I'm sure, but there are less painful ones too. But I mean, I wouldn't say that the struggle that we all feel inarticulate, but we also are, John, let's face it, also very verbal people, and we talk all the time. We don't talk as well as we write, of course, but that's by definition, I think, what writing is about, to be better than talk.
It's a replay.
Well, you get to rewrite. You don't get to re-talk. You get to, but you do get to rewrite. But I do think of them as very different activities because I guess I don't have this model of truth-telling or of chronicling, which seems to underlie everything that you said about writing fiction or about storytelling.
How does the story begin for you?
Well, let me just go back one step further. I mean, I think that when I write an essay, I am certainly, the motive for an essay is certainly something that I perceive or think about, or it's a set of problems which generates another set of problems and another and another and another, and then I find a pretext to talk about these problems in a particular work of art or situation or idea or whatever. But when I'm writing an essay, I am asking myself all the time, is it true what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, is it really like that? And that is the same question as, can I say it better? But the question of how I can say it better, in a more complex or subtle or eloquent way, that question is identical with, or goes side by side with the question of whether what I'm saying is actually true, whether
yes,
it makes sense,
yep,
whether
yes.
Whether it is even, in some cases, whether it's helpful to people. So, for instance, the question of intelligibility is very important to me when I'm writing an essay. But above all, the question of truth. I mean, to write an essay is to feel immediately responsible to something that, well, one calls for,
and when you write fiction, it's not...
No, it's not. No, I think when I'm writing fiction, well, there's always a sense of responsibility, because I think both you and I are the kind of people who feel and take on responsibilities with great avidity. But it isn't to some idea of the truth, except in a very ultimate and almost tautological sense. I think that when I move to write a story, it's not because I've heard a story, because I've heard, like everyone else, thousands of stories. It's because I hear language in my head. I hear a sentence, and I hear a voice. I hear voices, and then sometimes I just have a first sentence.
And you go on hearing that voice?
Yes,
the voice. It's like a dictation.
Yes, a dictation which then I can revise many times. But I mean, I remember one story. I heard a sentence in my head. I went to see the beautiful things, and then another voice says. No, the voice says, I went to see the beautiful things, and you know, and then another voice says, what? And then the first voice says, they're still there. And then the other voice says, but they won't be there for long. And I said to myself, who are these people? What are they saying? What are they talking about? And so it isn't exactly dictation, it's more like induction. Given the fact that I now have 4 lines on the page, what can I make of this? And sometimes I have to stop, and it takes days before I can figure out what the next line is. Or sometimes I go 5 pages and I'm stopped. The voices aren't talking anymore. Or in the case of one story, I heard the last line. The last line was, Sisyphus, nothing but nothing can tear me away from this rock. And I thought, now who is this grim stoical person who is proclaiming his or her fidelity to an unbearable situation? And I began to reason backward. Well, it could be a story of someone who, etc., etc. So for me, it's absolutely a process of invention, and one intimately connected with language, with tone, with voice.
I mean, maybe it's very interesting that, because it is, once more, and we've often touched upon this, because maybe we arrive at something quite similar, but it is the reverse process. I mean, for me, there's never that voice at the beginning. There is the enormous difficulty of seeing that situation, that person, of following
I don't
them.
see, I hear.
Now, I see.
That's perhaps why I like to make movies, because I don't see, I only hear when I write, and therefore I want very much to see, and that I like to do with images.
And then when that person
language.
is really there, which is probably in the real time of writing, somewhere around about 2/3, not necessarily 2/3 of the text, but 2/3 of the writing time, the months or the years, then suddenly the voices come. And then I just write. I mean, but they come after the situation or the people have been established, not before.
No, for me the people come out of the language. I feel...
And for me, the language comes out of the people.
I think my attitude is really... Well, for one thing, I mean, it's very clear from our conversation that I'm really loyal to certain modernist assumptions about art, about literature, which I think you have come to question and abandoned the practice of, because I think of earlier work of fiction of yours, like your novel G. You were doing then something that is closer to what I continue to do as a fiction writer, but the stories that you've been writing recently about peasant life are, I think, I don't know whether you feel that, in a very different mode or a very different model.
Because the subject is so different, I think. It's true.
Haven't you changed, John? Haven't you yourself changed?
I don't know. I had to relearn to write. That's true. Because the experience of the underprivileged or of peasants is very different from the experience of the privileged, and G is a book about them.
But do you constitute yourself as a reporter of your experience? I don't feel that I'm reporting on my experience at all.
No, I don't. Because I believe absolutely in experience being shareable. I believe that the imagination is precisely that. It begins very early in childhood. It begins with the identification of a child with a toy or with an animal. That capacity of empathy is, it seems to me, the first fruit of that social creation, which is imagination. And if in general today there is a kind of failure of nerve in fiction, what do I mean by that? I mean that...
Yes, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that most novels, probably, are really now disguised autobiographies. And on the other hand, people say, how do you have the right to write about peasants? You're not a peasant. How do you have the right to write about, for you to write about men? You're not a man, or vice versa. And these questions are very current. And the crisis of nerve, the failure of nerve, is that it is not possible to write about what one has not lived, or of what one has not seen. But I don't believe that.
You think that's why there's so many novels about professors? Because
yes,
professors
of course.
Or about writers?
Yes, obviously. And finally...
don't you think this also has to do with the competition of other modes of storytelling? Because we've gone from the broadest sense of storytelling, the oral storytelling, to the specifically literary model. But after all, we have storytelling through movies.
Yes, but there's always a story behind them. I mean, the story has to be written first, not necessarily in book form.
No, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying, don't you think that a lot of the so-called crisis of storytelling, which I think, and here I think you're thinking specifically of a crisis or a sense of incertitude or a limitation of ambitions, let's say, among most fiction writers. We're talking about the writers of so-called novels and stories, but a movie director, who is often, at least in Europe, the same person as the author of the script, doesn't think that he or she can not make a movie about some milieu or environment which he or she doesn't share. Movies are about lots of different things.
Yes.
Are about more different things, perhaps, than, I'm talking about serious movies, or movies we admire, we like, than fiction is. Why should the fiction writers be demoralized? Why should they feel these sorts of scruples that you're suggesting? I think it's partly because they feel the competition and the success of other modes of storytelling, which have a larger audience. The fact is that written fiction has proportionally a smaller audience.
And I think something different. I mean, I think that the novelist is somebody who says, come, and I'm going to show you what is happening inside that private house, that private heart. And it is finally the novel, which is a very small period of the millennia of storytelling, is about the private and the privileged. Which, I mean, there's no reason that when I say that, it's not that I'm denigrating novels, but I think that is at the heart of its form. And actually, what happens there is no longer very important in the world.
Oh, I couldn't disagree with you more. I mean, first of all, we have all the tradition of 19th century novel writing.
It was important then, very important.
But I think it's important now. I mean, I don't think Zola or Balzac or Dickens are saying, come, I will show you the private as opposed to the public. I think it's precisely that they thought that the private and the public were interrelated in a sense that we don't anymore. I think they still are. Why should they? I mean, human nature hasn't changed.
No, but the capacity of choices has changed. Novels are about choices. Stories are often about being up against it, where there's almost no choice except how do you react to that? With courage, with cunning, with caution, those sort of choices. But those big choices in which, and their consequences, which is the theme of so much in novels, those choices are no longer open to most people.
I don't believe that. I never thought I would come out as a great defender of the modern age, but I don't believe that people have fewer choices now. I think in many senses they have much larger choices. One could say that their sense of choice has been devalued precisely by being so expanded, as perhaps our sense of art has been devalued by the very multiplicity of art products that we're surrounded with through various means of reproduction and dissemination and diffusion of art. But I don't think we have fewer choices. I think we are precisely suffering from a kind of crisis of imagination or crisis of nerve. But I don't think it's because we're more unfree now than we were, or we don't make choices about our lives.
Who is we there? That's the important question. Yes, we are more free. But
well, I think more people are free, I think. The vast majority of people, of course, are not free in the sense that we in this part of the world are free. But I think more people are free. John, we're going to go on talking about this for many years, I'm sure. But now, alas, we have to stop. Good night.